I've always believed that silence is the most dangerous mistake people make when dealing with power-hungry bullies, especially the kind of bullies who hide behind rules, wear clipboards like armor, and think a title gives them the right to bulldoze over the lives of others. So, when the Willow Creek HOA tried to demolish my family farmhouse, the same home I grew up in, restored with my own hands, and planned to pass down one day, they thought I'd stay quiet, that I'd fold like everyone else had, but they didn't know who I was. They had no clue I'd just been elected the mayor of our small town 2 weeks before they taped that demolition notice to my front door, and they definitely didn't know I'd been waiting for them to cross the line. See, this wasn't just about my farmhouse, it was about decades of abuse, intimidation, and lies. The Willow Creek HOA had turned our once peaceful community into a nightmare of power plays and paranoia. Fines for mailbox height, threats over window curtains, petty complaints that led to real consequences, and for years they'd gotten away with it, until they came for me. And that's when I decided I was going to tear them down from the inside out. Let's rewind a little. This farmhouse wasn't just a house, it was my entire history. My great-grandfather built it with his own hands back in the 1930s. A simple structure at first, but solid 4 bedrooms, wraparound porch, and a small barn out back. Over the years, each generation added to it. My grandfather built the new kitchen. My dad added the greenhouse and solar panels. And me? I restored the entire place after college, repainted every plank, repaired the roof myself, installed the smart irrigation system for the orchard. I even rebuilt the picket fence that had been standing for nearly 80 years. But despite all the upgrades, it still looked like a modest home to the untrained eye. Just another piece of old land at the edge of the neighborhood. But to me, it was sacred. So when I opened my door one chilly morning to find a bright orange sticker slapped across the wooden panels that read, "Notice of Demolition, Unapproved Structure," I felt something inside me snap. Unapproved structure? I stormed inside, tore the notice off the door, and called the number listed. "Hello?" A bored voice answered. "This is Alex Bennett. I just found a demolition notice on my front door. What the hell is this about?" "Please hold," the woman said. 2 minutes later, a different voice came on. This one wasn't bored, it was smug. "Ah, Mr. Bennett, I see you've been notified. And I see you've lost your damn mind. There's no need for hostility," the voice replied. "We're simply enforcing HOA compliance. According to our records, your property was modified without proper approval. Several expansions were made without permits. That includes the greenhouse, the irrigation system, and the solar array. Your property violates Article 12B of the Willow Creek Residential Code." I laughed. "The greenhouse has been here for 16 years. The solar panels were approved by the Energy Board, and Article 12B doesn't even apply to structures built before 2000. "Well," the man said, sounding like he was smiling, "maybe you should bring that up at the hearing." "Hearing?" "Tomorrow at 10 a.m. HOA office. Don't be late." Click. That's when I realized this wasn't about compliance. This was about revenge. I'd been elected mayor 2 weeks ago. It was a narrow race, but I'd won by standing up against the very overreach this HOA had become infamous for. Their president, Cheryl Whitman, had ruled this place like a tyrant for years. She'd buried small business owners in fines, forced retirees to repaint their homes, and once even had a tree cut down from a veteran's yard because it obstructed the community line of sight. And I ran my campaign by promising to take her power away. She knew exactly who I was, and now I knew exactly what she was doing. The next morning, I arrived at the HOA office 15 minutes early. I wore my mayoral pin knot out of arrogance, but as a reminder. They didn't own this town anymore. The office was packed. Cheryl sat at the head of a long table, flanked by her loyal board members. Her smile was sharp and smug, like a wolf playing dress-up. "Mr. Bennett," she said as I entered, "we're glad you could join us." "I'm sure you are," I replied, taking a seat. "Let's get this circus started." "We're here today to address the numerous violations found on your property," Cheryl began, reading from a stack of papers. "Satellite imagery and HOA inspection reports show extensive unauthorized modifications to a structure originally built outside the association's architectural oversight." She paused, as if waiting for applause. Instead, I leaned back and asked, "And when did the HOA receive jurisdiction over pre-zoned agricultural land?" Cheryl blinked. "Excuse me?" "My farmhouse predates the Willow Creek development by nearly 60 years, I said. "It was designated agricultural, grandfathered in. You never had legal control over it to begin with." There was a murmur from the board members. "We have updated maps to support documents like they were radioactive. But, Cheryl stammered, "you're on the HOA mailing list." "Which I never asked to be on," I said. "You've been sending letters to me for years assuming authority you don't have, and now you want to demolish my family home because I called you out for what you are?" Cheryl's face twisted. "You can't talk to me like that." "I'm your mayor," I said, standing up. "I can talk to you however I damn well please." And that was the moment everything changed. The room was so quiet you could have heard a pin drop. Cheryl's smug expression had shattered like glass. Her board members looked like they wanted to be anywhere but sitting next to her. One of them, Roger, if I remembered right, was already inching his chair away from her, like being too close might make him guilty by association. I leaned forward, placing both palms on the table. "Now, let me make this very clear," I said. "If a single piece of demolition equipment even touches my fence, I will not only file criminal trespassing charges. I will personally have the county sheriff arrest every person responsible." Cheryl opened her mouth, but I cut her off. "And before you try to quote some obscure clause or make up a new bylaw on the spot, let me remind you that, as mayor, I now have authority to investigate any organization operating within town limits. That includes the Willow Creek HOA, so I suggest you think very carefully about your next move." Her face flushed red. "This is an outrage," she hissed. "You're abusing your power." "No," I said calmly. "I'm protecting my home, something you clearly forgot how to do." Then I turned, tipped an imaginary hat to the rest of the board, and walked out. But trust me, I was just getting started. Back at my farmhouse, I paced across the porch, my mind racing. Cheryl had overplayed her hand by going after me so directly. But I knew her. She wasn't the type to back off just because she'd been embarrassed. She'd double down, go quiet for a while, then find a sneakier way to retaliate. And I couldn't just wait around for that. I had to make the first move. So I called an emergency town council meeting. At first, some of the council members hesitated. "Is this really worth using official time?" one of them asked. "An HOA problem?" But when I laid out the facts, how Cheryl and her board had been overstepping for years, fining families into submission, and now targeting property outside their legal zone, they got on board fast, especially when I pulled up the public complaint database. Over 200 residents had filed grievances against the HOA in the last 3 years. Most had been dismissed or ignored. But the complaints painted a very clear picture: weaponized fines, sudden rule changes, intimidation tactics, and, in several cases, allegations of fraud. Going to hurt? The motion passed unanimously. We're closing in. 2 days later, I walked into town hall to find a massive envelope sitting on my desk. No return address. Inside, anonymously submitted documents, internal HOA emails, financial spreadsheets, meeting transcripts. At first, I thought it was just angry resident gossip until I read one of the subject lines. Misuse of emergency funds, cover it up. Budget that had somehow been reclassified as an urgent maintenance emergency, a trick that allowed them to bypass community votes and funnel the funds into approved vendors. The vendors? All connected to Cheryl's brother-in-law's contracting company. It was a textbook shell game. Fake emergencies, fake quotes, real money. And this was just one thread. Another file contained complaints that had been altered before being submitted to county records. Residents who had accused the HOA of abuse suddenly found their own words rewritten to sound like apologies. A woman named Marlene Jensen had supposedly written, "Thank you for the fair resolution." Her actual email? "I'm being bullied and threatened with eviction. Please help." This was way bigger than my farmhouse now. This was systemic corruption, and I finally had the proof. I called in a favor from my friend Leah at the local paper. She was an investigative reporter with a sharp tongue and zero patience for bullies. When I showed her the documents, her eyes lit up. "Alex," she said, "this is gold. Can you run it?" "Can I run it?" she laughed. "I'm about to blow this story sky high." We planned a full expose headline, quotes, photo of the farmhouse, and a breakdown of how the HOA had been manipulating the system for years. Leah even tracked down past board members who'd quit because they couldn't stand Cheryl's games anymore. They were ready to talk, on record. The article went live the next morning, and Willow Creek hasn't been the same since. The town exploded. My phone lit up nonstop with messages. Some were from residents I'd never met, thanking me. Others were angry board members demanding I take the article down, which, of course, I didn't. The HOA's office got swamped with calls and drop-ins. Even the county compliance inspector showed up unannounced that afternoon. But the best part? Cheryl tried to hold a damage control meeting that night at the clubhouse. Only 2 board members showed up. Everyone else had either resigned or disappeared. I watched from across the street as Cheryl paced behind the clubhouse window, clearly fuming. A stack of flyers sat on the table behind her, some desperate attempt to blame media distortion and call for unity. But it was too late. People had seen the truth, and I was just warming up. Later that week, I sat down with the new acting HOA treasurer, a quiet man named Jorge who looked like he'd aged 10 years in 2 weeks. "Look," he said, "I didn't know everything. I just handled the numbers they gave me." "I believe you," I said. "But now we need to clean this up." He nodded slowly. "I've started compiling the real books," he said, "the ones that match the receipts. The difference is shocking." "How shocking?" "Hundreds of thousands." My stomach sank. Cheryl hadn't just stolen funds. She'd gutted the HOA account, remodeled her home using landscape credits, bought new furniture and labeled it boardroom upgrades, even expensed a trip to Maui as an out-of-state conference. "We're going to report this to the state attorney's office," I said. Jorge nodded. "I'll get you everything." And that's when I knew. Cheryl wasn't going to slither out of this one. Not this time. By now, Cheryl had stopped showing her face in public. No more HOA patrols, no more smug notes on windshields, and certainly no more veiled threats about property compliance. She had gone dark, probably hiding behind a lawyer, or locked away in her over-decorated house trying to find a way out. But for the rest of us, things were just heating up. Once the article dropped and Jorge started pulling financial records, the town council officially escalated the case. We submitted everything to the State Housing Authority, including sworn statements from residents who had been fined, evicted, or harassed without just cause. And while that was moving through the pipeline, I had another plan cooking. You see, I knew Cheryl was still clinging to one last hope, that she could hold the HOA elections next quarter and rally her inner circle to re-elect her before anything became official. But I had other plans. I scheduled an emergency town-wide referendum. The issue? Whether or not the Willow Creek HOA should be stripped of its governing authority and replaced by a publicly elected community council with oversight, transparency, and direct voting rights for every resident. The moment that went public, I got calls from neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years. "Alex, do you need help canvassing? Can I donate to the campaign? Do we finally get to vote that witch out?" The support was overwhelming. And Cheryl? Well, she'd have to crawl out from under her rock eventually, because this time it was the entire town against her. On the night of the public debate, the town hall was packed. Every seat taken. People standing against the walls, some even outside watching on a live feed. You'd think we were electing a new president, not debating a suburban HOA. I took the stage first, outlining what we'd uncovered: the financial misconduct, the abuse of power, the years of unchecked authority. Then I presented the community council plan: real transparency, open voting, and term limits. No more secret fines, no more weaponized bylaws, just real neighbors solving real problems together. The applause was thunderous. Then Cheryl took the stage, and it was awkward. She looked tired, frazzled, like she hadn't slept in days, but she still tried to play the same old tune. "I have always acted in the best interests of Willow Creek," she began, her voice cracking. "Any mistakes made were purely administrative and do not warrant dismantling an entire governing body." Someone in the crowd coughed, loudly, sarcastically. "You mean your personal ATM?" someone else muttered. Cheryl pressed on, ignoring the heckling. "If we allow this radical shift in leadership, we risk chaos. We risk—" "Transparency?" I interjected from my seat. "Accountability?" More cheers. Her eyes flared, but the damage was done. When the moderator asked for a show of hands who supported dissolving the HOA, the room lit up like a Christmas tree. Cheryl turned pale. She knew it was over. The next week, the results were certified. 82% of residents voted to dissolve the HOA. Effective immediately, its power was revoked, its accounts frozen, and its leadership pending investigation. I'd never seen Jorge look so relieved. "I've already submitted the final ledgers," he said, handing me a thick folder. "And one more thing." He pulled out a USB drive. "What's this?" I asked. "Recordings," he said, "from HOA meetings. Cheryl didn't know I kept backups. You'll want to listen to the one labeled August 12th. That night, I plugged the drive into my laptop, snapped in the recording. "That farmhouse is a blight. It doesn't fit our aesthetic. If the county won't condemn it, we'll find another way. Push zoning, push inspections. I want it gone." Another voice, Roger, one of her board members, hesitated. "But Alex owns that property. It's outside HOA jurisdiction." "I don't care," Cheryl hissed. "We'll redraw the map if we have to." There it was. Admittance of intent to harass, to abuse power, and most importantly, evidence she knew the farmhouse wasn't under her control. She had just handed me the rope she'd hang herself with. I wasted no time. The following morning, I delivered the USB and accompanying transcript to the district attorney's office. The DAA, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Rosalind Hayes, listened to the audio twice, then looked up at me. "This is more than misconduct," she said. "This is targeted harassment, abuse of office, possibly even a criminal conspiracy." "Do you think it's enough?" I asked. She nodded slowly. "Oh, it's enough." And just like that, the legal wheels started turning. 3 weeks later, Cheryl was served. Official charges were abuse of authority, misuse of HOA funds, targeted harassment, attempted property seizure under false pretenses. She was booked that afternoon. The mugshot went viral. The woman who once strutted through the neighborhood with a clipboard and a power complex now stared dead-eyed into a camera in an orange jumpsuit. Roger resigned that same day. Jorge stepped forward to testify. And the residents, they threw a block party. By the time Cheryl was arraigned, our sleepy town had become a local media sensation. News vans were parked outside City Hall. Reporters roamed the streets, interviewing residents about their dictator HOA president. And the cherry on top? A trending hashtag, #CherylGate. I never thought my old farmhouse and a few peppery town hall meetings would become the catalyst for a grassroots revolution. But here we were, free of HOA tyranny and rebuilding trust, one neighbor at a time. But I wasn't done yet. Because Cheryl's downfall wasn't just about restoring balance. It was about protecting the people who had been trampled under her reign and making damn sure it never happened again. So I rolled up my sleeves and got to work. The first order of business? Restoring the farmhouse, the one she tried to demolish. The one that stood long before the HOA ever existed. The one that represented everything this town used to stand for: community, self-reliance, and history. I put in a request to the new community council to designate the farmhouse as a protected historical landmark. It passed unanimously. Next, we launched a volunteer initiative. Carpenters, electricians, painters, people from all over town came to pitch in. Some of them had never even been inside the place before, but they showed up with toolkits and coffee, ready to rebuild what Cheryl had tried to erase. Mark, a retired builder and longtime friend, stood beside me on the first morning and clapped a hand on my shoulder. "You know," he said, "this used to be a town of neighbors, not contracts, not codes, just people helping each other out." I nodded. "Well," I said, "maybe it still is." Within 6 weeks, the farmhouse was fully restored. We preserved the original stonework, refinished the hardwood floors, and repainted the siding to match its original color-warm chestnut with white trim. It looked better than ever, but it wasn't just about looks. The farmhouse became the new meeting place for the community council, a symbolic move to remind everyone where this town came from and where it was going. The first council meeting held there was standing room only. People brought their kids. Others brought baked goods, and someone even handed me a carved wooden sign that read, "By the people, for the people." It hung proudly over the front door from that day on. Meanwhile, Cheryl's trial was underway. The evidence was overwhelming. The audio recordings, the financial records, the testimonies. It all painted a picture of a woman so obsessed with control, she was willing to bend or break any rule to get her way. The prosecutor didn't hold back, oneself at the expense of others. Cheryl's defense, weak at best. She claimed she had been misguided and poorly advised. That she was only trying to improve the community. That she didn't realize her actions were illegal. But when the jury heard the recording of her saying, "We'll redraw the map if we have to," it was game over. Verdict? Guilty. On all counts. Sentence? 5 years probation, a $75,000 fine, and a permanent ban from holding any public or private office involving property governance. Oh, and she had to issue a public apology. Live, on camera. I remember watching the broadcast. Cheryl stood stiffly behind a podium outside the courthouse, face as blank as a granite slab. She read from a prepared statement, voice flat. "I would like to apologize to the residents of Willow Creek for my actions. I acknowledge the harm caused by my decisions and accept full responsibility for the consequences. I hope to learn and grow from this experience." It was the most robotic thing I'd ever heard. But it didn't matter, because the town wasn't listening for sincerity. They were listening for closure. And they got it. With the Cheryl era finally closed, the town started to blossom in unexpected ways. People who had stopped decorating their homes out of fear of fines began putting up flower boxes and painting their shutters. Kids played in the cul-de-sacs again. Backyard BBQs made a comeback. The change was palpable, and the community council, thriving. We held monthly town halls where residents could actually vote on policies. We introduced initiatives for community gardens, local business grants, and even set up a neighborhood newsletter written entirely by kids and teens. One afternoon, I walked into the farmhouse-turned-council hall and found a group of middle schoolers organizing canned goods for a food drive. "Mr. Mayor," one of them beamed, "we raised over 400 items." I grinned. "That's amazing. You guys are making this town proud." They beamed. And in that moment I realized this town wasn't just recovering, it was thriving. Because when people are given a voice when they're no longer ruled by fear, they start to care again. Under a new name, same rules, same power plays, same blueprint. Not on my watch. I made a few calls, spoke with the mayor of the neighboring town, shared everything we'd uncovered about Evelyn's time in Willow Creek. And, wouldn't you know it, the official reason? History of abuse of governance and community endangerment. Poetic, really? Dismantled, life felt, peaceful. But just when I thought the dust had fully settled, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived. It was hand-delivered, no return address. Just a single name written in sharp cursive on the front. To the mayor. Inside, a thank you note, written by a woman named Margaret, a retired nurse who had lived in Willow Creek since it was nothing but dirt roads and half-built homes. She wrote about how she'd watched the town lose its soul under HOA rule, how she had been fined for planting roses, how she'd almost sold her home just to escape, but she stayed. And now she was planting those roses again. She ended with a single line that stuck with me. "You didn't just save a house, Alex. You gave us our home back." Just when I thought we could breathe easy, an unexpected storm started brewing. It wasn't from an outside force, or even remnants of Cheryl's regime. No, this one came from inside the community council. Turns out, one of our newer members, Brad, had a slightly different idea of leadership. Where the rest of us saw transparency, he saw opportunity. And where we prioritized fairness, he saw a chance to become the next big shot. Within a few short weeks, he started proposing rules that sounded eerily familiar. Lawn restrictions, architectural approvals, even mandatory paint colors. At first, people gave him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he was just ambitious, or confused about our new community-driven structure. But when he proposed a vote to form a new oversight committee, one that would have authority to fine residents for non-compliance with visual standards, we knew exactly what he was doing. He was trying to resurrect the HOA, not under the same name, of course, but a wolf in rebranded sheep's clothing is still a wolf, and I wasn't about to let another Cheryl slither in through the back door. So, at the next council meeting, I addressed it head-on. The room was packed again, just like it had been during the HOA hearings. Brad sat near the front, papers in hand, still wearing that smug little smirk he'd perfected. I cleared my throat and raised a printed copy of his proposal. "I want to be very clear," I said, voice steady but firm. "This document is not a suggestion for community improvement. It is a blueprint for reinstating the very structure we fought to dismantle." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Brad's smile faltered. "These regulations," I continued, "go against everything we've worked to rebuild. We voted for freedom, not surveillance with a fresh coat of paint." Brad tried to defend himself. He claimed it was about maintaining standards, about preserving property values. But the crowd wasn't buying it. Not this time. A woman in the back, an artist named Lisa who had repainted her home with vibrant murals after Cheryl's fall, stood up and said, "My home's value went up because people want to live here now, not because some board told me what color to use." Another man added, "We didn't tear down a dictatorship just to let a clone sneak in and start writing tickets again." The crowd erupted into applause. Brad turned red, flustered and fumbling with his notes. I didn't need to say another word. By the end of the meeting, we took a formal vote to reject Brad's proposal. It failed, spectacularly. Not a single hand went up in support. The Community Council then passed a resolution to permanently ban any attempt to form a governing body with the power to fine or penalize residents for aesthetic or non-safety-related issues. It was a mouthful, but the message was clear. No more HOAs. Not in disguise, not ever again. Brad resigned a few days later, citing philosophical differences. And just like that, the last spark of authoritarian rule was stamped out before it could catch fire. In the months that followed, Willow Creek became more than just a nice place to live. It became a beacon. Other towns started reaching out. Officials, citizens, even journalists wanted to know how we did it, how we tore down an abusive HOA and replaced it with something that actually worked. I started getting invited to town halls in other countries to speak about community reform, local governance, and the danger of unchecked authority. It felt surreal. I wasn't a politician. I never planned to be mayor. I was just a guy trying to protect his home. But sometimes that's exactly who you want in charge, someone with skin in the game. One day, I came home to find a small envelope on my porch. No stamp, no address, just my name written in neat, slanted handwriting. Inside was a photo. It was of the farmhouse, taken from the street at sunset, golden light spilling across the porch. On the back, a message was written in ink. "This town looks different now. It feels different. Thank you." No name, no signature, just that. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, because for the first time in years, this town didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like home. The day the town officially decommissioned the old HOA headquarters was the day it really felt over. We held a ceremony. Nothing fancy. Just a gathering in front of the building with neighbors, council members, and even some folks who had once supported the HOA but later admitted their regrets. The building itself wasn't much. Beige stucco, a sagging roof, and a rusted sign that read Oak Valley Property Management. It had always felt sterile, cold, and authoritarian. We voted unanimously to repurpose it into something useful, something community-centered. And I knew exactly what that should be. A public library and resource center. Not just for books, but for gardening workshops, town records access, DIY seminars, and free legal aid for homeowners who'd been burned by bad contracts. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same building once used to bully residents would now be used to empower them. Within 2 months, the transformation began. Volunteers showed up in droves. Painters, carpenters, electricians. Even a retired architect who lived down the street offered to redesign the interior pro bono. It was a reminder that when fear is gone, good people show up. At the grand opening, I stood by the door with a pair of oversized scissors and a red ribbon across the entryway. Mark, my neighbor and one of the loudest voices against Cheryl, stood next to me holding a tray of chili dogs and grinning like it was Christmas. A little girl handed me a card she'd drawn with crayon. It showed the library building, big sunshine overhead, and people smiling around it. In the corner, she'd written, "Thank you, Mayor." I wasn't the emotional type, but I'll be honest, I had to wipe my eyes. That building didn't just hold books now, it held dignity. Cheryl, for her part, faded from the public eye. Last I heard, she had tried to move to another HOA-run suburb 2 towns over, but word spread fast. Apparently, her reputation preceded her. No one wanted her on any board. Her consulting business went belly up. Her LinkedIn profile quietly disappeared. It turns out, when your entire brand is HOA Power Trip, it's hard to pivot once everyone realizes you're the villain. Karma didn't forget her, and neither did we. But we didn't need revenge. Cheryl had already destroyed her own castle, brick by brick. Meanwhile, my farmhouse? It became something of a local landmark. Not because it was flashy or historic, it wasn't either of those things. But because it stood for something. The house that survived the wrecking ball. The home that refused to be bullied out of existence. People would stop by and ask to take photos in front of it. I even had to install a small sign out front. Yes, this is the house. No, Cheryl doesn't live here anymore. Yes, you can take a picture, just don't trample the roses. I leaned into the legend. Why not? We held our first community harvest festival on the lawn that fall. Kids ran around with painted faces, music played from a speaker someone wheeled in on a dolly, and Mark grilled corn while trading HOA horror stories with anyone who'd listen. Local artists sold crafts from little booths. Someone made a scarecrow that looked suspiciously like Cheryl and named it Violation Vera. We even held a mock vote where people got to fine the scarecrow for made-up infractions. Excessive blinking, possession of happiness, unauthorized use of joy. It was dumb. It was hilarious. It was freedom. I looked out over the crowd that evening, over the lights strung between trees, over the laughter, the music, the families who once feared opening their mailboxes because of HOA threats, and I felt something settle deep in my chest. Peace. Not because we had won, but because we had endured, because we had rebuilt. Not just structures, but trust. That's the thing about bullies. They think control is permanent. They think fear lasts forever. But when people finally stand up, When they see what's possible on the other side of intimidation, those bullies shrink fast, and in their place, something better grows. So, if you ever find yourself staring down the barrel of an unjust HOA, a petty tyrant, or a system that values power over people, remember this: you're not alone, you're not powerless, and sometimes the best way to defend your home is to run for mayor. Because once they find out who they're messing with, they'll wish they'd just left you and your farmhouse alone.